Sound checks. Thank you for colleagues coming in. Just before I call on Mr. McGuinty and Madame Marcoux, I just wanted to update members. There's been some developments with respect to our agenda. The first development with our agenda was that Mr. Justice Bastarash is willing to come before the committee. As of Friday, he was willing to come before the committee on the 7th. Now that date has been moved up to the 2nd of December. And I propose giving him the full 2-hour slot in order to be able to talk about that report on the RCMP. The second thing is I noticed while we were doing voting or QP, I'm not quite sure, that the fiscal update is scheduled for November 30th. That I will take guidance from colleagues as to whether we just cancel November 30th outright. Both developments will make some serious dents in our previously agreed upon agenda. So prior to Wednesday, I would appreciate the subcommittee communicating with me as to whether there are, as to how we want to proceed. Probably I'll reach out to each one of you and try to reorder the agenda so that we have a fully productive period of time from today through to the end of session. So with that, I'm going to welcome Mr. McGuinty and Madame Marcoux to the committee to present their report. I have to say, Mr. McGuinty, and given our long standing friendship and your superior knowledge of parliamentary procedures, I found this report utterly, well, I wanted to say unintelligible, but I'm rather hoping that you can explain it to me, because I've given a couple of shots at trying to understand what was being recommended in this report. There's so many deletions and all in the report that it makes it very difficult to follow the narrative. So for the sake of the chair, Mr. McGuinty, I'm rather hoping you give the dummies version of your report. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll do my very best to try to accommodate you and other colleagues. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for allowing us to be here. We're very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians' 2019 annual report and a separate special report, both tabled in Parliament on March 12th of this year. By way of background, the committee met 25 times between February and August of 2019. It heard from 48 senior officials from government and civil society, and it relied for this work on over 30,000 pages of classified information. Turning now to our first review, diversity and inclusion in the security and intelligence community. This first ever review provides a baseline of where the S&I community is in terms of diversity and inclusion for women, Aboriginal peoples, members of visible minorities, and persons with disabilities. Our review shows that the representation of these designated groups is lower than the overall Canadian public service, particularly members of visible minorities, and perhaps more troubling, rates of harassment and discrimination remain unacceptably high. Les dirigeants de ces organisations sont tous engagés à...
The directors of these organizations are all committed to improving diversity and inclusion among their respective staffs. However, sustained direction, general engagement, and greater responsibility throughout the security and intelligence community are essential to make sure that these organizations reflect and truly include the diversity of Canada. The committee recommended that there be an examination, a study in 3 to 5 years in order to evaluate progress. We also recommended improvement in the collection and analysis of data and the creation of a common set of measurements.
To the review examining the threat of foreign interference in Canada and the government response to that threat. The committee agreed to focus its efforts on traditional person-to-person foreign interference. We did not examine questions surrounding electoral integrity, did not review cyber threats and did not examine foreign acquisitions of Canadian business under the Investment Canada Act. The review concludes that there is significant and sustained foreign interference exercised by a number of foreign actors seeking to covertly and inappropriately interfere or exert influence in Canada. It also found that the government's response to this threat was done on a case-by-case, even ad hoc basis, and that our engagement with other levels of government and the Canadian public was limited. Par conséquent, le comité recommande au gouvernement.
Therefore, the committee recommends that the government support a strategy to counter foreign interference and to improve resilience. Our recommendation specifies in a rather detailed way what should be included in such a strategy, as presented in paragraph 297. The committee also recommends that the government support its strategy through a directive and sustained central coordination. Let's now go on to the third study in the annual report, the Canada Border Services Agency. The committee conducted the first independent study of national security and intelligence activities that are the most sensitive in the agency, including surveillance, the use of confidential human sources, and joint operations.
The committee found that CBSA's authorities are clear, well-governed, and supported by several statutes. However, CBSA does not have ministerial direction for its conduct of national security and intelligence activities. This constitutes a gap in ministerial accountability. The committee recommends that the Minister of Public Safety issue formal direction to CBSA consistent with the practice at CSIS and the RCMP. NSECOP also prepared a special report on the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces. During a 2018 review of DND's defence intelligence activities, DND provided the committee with an internal directive that gives guidance to troops and employees on how to manage the collection of Canadian citizen information. This is known as the CANCIT Directive. Le comité a décidé de mener un examen spécial.
The committee decided to have a special examination of this directive to understand what legislation governed the collection, use, conservation, and dissemination of intelligence on Canadians by the department, and to evaluate the measure in which the application of this directive brought about risks, both legal and operational. The committee concluded that the CANCIT directive was not sufficiently clear and recommended that the department cooperate with the Privacy Commissioner to review all directives related to defense intelligence.
They formed an opinion that DND defense intelligence activities conducted as part of overseas operations may not be in compliance with the Privacy Act. The committee referred this matter as a result to the Attorney General pursuant to its obligation under Section 31.1 of the NSECOP Act, which reads as follows, Mr. Chair. The committee must inform the appropriate minister and the Attorney General of Canada of any activity that is carried out by a department and is related to national security and intelligence, and that, in the committee's opinion, may not be in compliance with the law. The committee also calls on the Minister of National Defence to ensure DND complies with the letter and spirit of the Privacy Act in all of its defence intelligence activities, whether they are conducted in Canada or abroad. In 2018, NSECOP recommended that the government give serious consideration to providing explicit legislative authority for the conduct of defense intelligence activities. In 2019, the committee goes further, calling on the Minister of National Defence to introduce legislation to govern defense intelligence activities. In response, the Ministers of National Defence and Public Safety have both been mandated to develop a framework governing defence intelligence. Thank you very much for your attention, colleagues. Those are my comments. I would say, Mr. Chair, if I could, if we're not able to answer detailed questions during this session, we would be pleased to provide written responses to you for the committee. I also want to note that this is a 182-page report, plus the special report on DND and the Canadian Armed Forces. We would welcome good comments, feedback, positive criticism on how we can do our work even better for the committee, for parliamentarians, and for Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McGuinty. And indeed, my initial, I hope, constructive criticism was ameliorated somewhat by your timely intervention. So with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Kirk, Mr. Iachino, Madame Michaud, and Mr. Harris for 6 minutes each, starting with Mr. Kirk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. McGuinty, for coming before the committee today. And certainly it's been enlightening as I have gone through the information that the reports that this committee has provided to Parliament, and the important work, I think, in ensuring that there is oversight in Canada's national security infrastructure. My first question is, there's been three areas that have been studied in regards to foreign interference. Sorry, you've omitted 3 areas in regards to studying foreign interference: election tampering, foreign investment reviews, and cyber threats, which I believe your committee will be delving into this year. That's my understanding. I'm wondering if NSECOP will be looking into the security of our elections and foreign investments in this in the upcoming studies you have planned.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kurek, and Mr. Chair, through you to my colleague. A few things. The important thing I think to remember first off is that NSECOP is not so much an oversight committee as it is a review committee. In this, we differ from our American counterparts and are more in line with our other Five Eye partners, whether that's the ISC in the United Kingdom or the New Zealand model. It's a little different in Australia, but just to point out for listeners and viewers and for Mr. Kurek's benefit, that it's more a focus on review than it is oversight. The question of cyber threats is exactly what the committee is seized with now, Mr. Kurek, in this particular round of reviews. This cyber threat review is very considerable. I think we've already received roughly 18,000 pages of documents. On this front, we'll be evaluating the cyber threat question and the government's ability to respond to that threat. We're also delving now deeply into the security and intelligence activities of the Global Affairs Department, something that has never been done before. We try to pursue some of these reviews in areas that have never been reviewed before, like the Department of National Defense, like CBSA, and of course, like GAC. What was your other question, sir?
And whether the committee will be looking into the security of elections and foreign interference, just if those two issues will be covered. So just the election side, I think, is.
Thank you. So as committee members may know, Cabinet in 2019 passed a directive creating a 5-person committee to be seized with activities during the 2019 election and basically be the recipients of information. This is a committee chaired by the clerk, be seized with this information that was coming in from different information providers and make a determination whether or not a certain threshold was crossed, applying a certain test as to whether this 5-person committee led by the clerk ought to communicate with Canadians something untoward or something inappropriate that might have been going on during the election. A recent report was just completed by the former Deputy Minister and Clerk, Jim Judd. I believe he was a clerk, and he has made that report public. That report is now still with the members of the NSECOP, with the National Security and Intelligence Committee. The unredacted version is with us. We are considering it now, and we'll have more to say about that in due course in commentary to the Prime Minister in terms of how this committee is structured, its mandate, etc.
Okay.
So we won't be looking so much at
On va pas. Je peux vous envoyer plus d'informations.
on cyber threats, if that would be helpful.
Sure, I would appreciate that. And I'd ask, Mr. Chair, how much time do I have?
Minute and a half.
Okay, so I think that as certainly the official opposition has been seized with the issue of Huawei. So I'm trying to meld a couple of questions that I have into one. And very simply, Mr. McGuinty, given this report and the work that this committee has done, do you believe that Canada should exclude Huawei from its 5G network?
Not a question I'm able to answer, Mr. Keurig, on behalf of the committee. It is
Sure.
not something the committee has examined. It's not a review that we've undertaken. We have, of course, had a lot to say about foreign interference in our review, and would commend you to that particular, those pages, which sets out in great detail what we believe is happening. So I wish I could give you some indication, but the committee has not pronounced itself on this.
Sure, no, and I appreciate that. There's two countries specifically named in these reports, and that's Russia and China, two countries widely reported to have acted against Canada and our allies. Experts who have appeared before this committee have suggested that China is a more complex actor, while Russia is more blunt and overt. Does Canada have different strategies in dealing with both of these foreign state actors and their involvement and possible threats to Canada?
We're unfortunately going to have to leave that important question there. I think Mr. McGuinty has already indicated he's in no position to answer that kind of a question. Possibly he is, in which case you'll work answer in back on the next round of questions. Mr. Iacono, 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, colleagues. So in the NSECOP report, there are some mentions about the issues of foreign interference. You said that foreign interference is going to erode steadily our fundamental institutions as well as our democratic system. Could you provide more details how foreign powers such as China can manage to destabilize our democracy? Thank you, Mr. Iacono, for your question. In the report, there are 20 pages that provide details about specific incidents that occurred in Canada and abroad. I cannot tell you more than what is already in the report. There is a lot of classified information, but that information hasn't been shared in the public report. So here's my suggestion. Look at the case studies that were presented. Those case studies are quite detailed. And those case studies show you how foreign actors can act. We acknowledge that this is a huge problem for Canada and other countries. Those dangers related to foreign interference can be a source of fear and paranoia for Canadians, but foreign interference could also be the source of conspiracy theories. and those theories are spread through social media. Could you explain how our government should tackle those issues when communicating to Canadians? First, we have to remember the following. When we are talking about ethnocultural communities, we should not forget that those communities are targeted by foreign actors. Those communities are victims. They are victims here in Canada. The government has the duty to protect its citizens. The report has some recommendations, and one of our main recommendations is a pan-government approach to see how we react and cooperate between different levels of government. We have to review how we work with Canadians, our academic institutions, our politicians. We recommended twice that politicians and MPs are subject to a deep briefing related to foreign interference. All the recommendations are in the report. The recommendations are there so that the government can improve its work. We were inspired by the case study done in Australia. Australia has made a lot of stride. Anyway, we suggested to explore the Australian model for Canada. So you talked about the FBI as well as measures taken by Australia. So here's my question. What should be the measures to be undertaken by this government to make up for our delay? We have to keep working for a more centralized and more coordinated approach, especially with the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. We have to study the task force that was recently created in Australia. Such a task force should collaborate further with the government. Maybe for us in Canada, such a task force could collaborate with CSIS and other actors. All of this to say that there is a lot of work to do because there are a lot of risks. The committee agrees with what we said. All parties, both houses of the parliament, want to see action. Thank you. That's it for me, Mr. Chair.
Madame Michaud, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Ms. Michaud. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for saying that you felt a little bit lost after reading this report, and so I am looking forward to hearing more about what Mr. McGuinty has to say. I'd like to ask questions about diversity and inclusion in the security and intelligence community. We've heard about many harassment, racism, and sexual violence cases through the RCMP as well as in our jail system. Recently, a report showed that such cases occurred between security officers and inmates. So, Mr. McGuinty, you reviewed all of this. So, I would like you to tell us more about the cases that you studied, more specifically for your report. Wow, what a question. Do we have 30 minutes to answer? So here is what we did. For the first time, we studied 9 agencies that work in security and intelligence. D&D, CSIS, Global Affairs, Privy Council Office, etc. I'm sorry, I don't know the word in French. We established a baseline. We wanted to compare performance, the representation of women, indigenous people, as well as visible minorities, people with disabilities. We didn't review the issues of violence and discrimination, but of course it is something that we mentioned to the government. That being said, we do not have access to the best talents in Canada. Why? Because we don't know what the status is within those 9 bodies. We know that studies conducted by FBI, CIA, and others show that diversity and inclusion in those bodies and communities help improve performance and responsibility for those agencies. And Mr. Chair, can I ask Ms. Marco to provide her input? Sure. What was the goal of our study? It was a 2-pronged goal. First, we wanted to show how diversity fares within the security and intelligence community. Second, we wanted to present programs and policies throughout those departments. Policies that were created to develop diversity and inclusion within those departments and bodies. Those were taken into account in our recommendations. Our main recommendation is that our committee should be able to review all of this 3 years from now based on improved data collection. Thank you. And I'd like to go back to what you said at the beginning, Mr. Quinty. I'm not sure I follow you. You were talking about best talents. How come we do not know the status with regard to this within the 9 bodies? So what's the status? It is rather positive, negative? Well, that's the question, Ms. Michaud. We want to find the answer to this question. Right now, we cannot tell Canadians whether things have improved or not. What is the committee trying to say? We want to get the best talents in Canada, but because there hasn't been any proper review with regard to diversity and inclusion within the security and intelligence community, we want to make sure that we have access to the best talents for that community. And such study should look at women, visible minorities, persons with disabilities, and indigenous people. This is why we want to create a baseline to make further review and move forward. The executives of those 9 bodies are aware of all of this. However, it hasn't been a high priority yet.
Mr. Harris, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. McGinty, for your presentation and your report. I'll just touch briefly on the diversity and inclusion study, and it seems to me rather disappointing that there's been such slow progress. But you seem to be telling us you don't even know what the level of progress is. Although I note that you say that there seems to be a lack of engagement by the whole of these agencies, and it's all left up to the HR department, which indicates the lack of a lack of real concern to actually achieve goals. And I'm wondering why your report simply asks for a 3 to 5 year review of where things are going, as opposed to insisting upon the setting of goals and targets and something like that. This seems to be an inadequate response to what you've clearly identified as slow progress.
Well, thank you, Mr. Harris. I think one of the things we did point out in the report, I think as possible, was we took a long, hard look at the Prime Minister's Tiger Team, which was created in 2016. And we called out the fact that the Tiger Team set up to develop performance measurement framework for the entire federal government hadn't met since June of 2018. So we believe there's supposed to be a report every 6 months to the Deputy Secretary of the Cabinet. So July 2018 was the last meeting that we could find. So we went as far as we felt we could as a committee to call on the government to make improvement, and we set the baseline because there hadn't been an examination, Mr. Harris, at all ever before that we could find of diversity and inclusion in the 9 organizations that constitute the community. So we felt it was important to call it out and to cite statistically and on an evidence base with the facts exactly where we stood. And now we're looking for progress. We've called on the government to take certain measures. We'll see what the government does.
Well, there seems to be a significant lack of commitment, obviously, that you've identified, and I think I'm surprised it didn't appear more obvious in your recommendations. But thank you for pointing that out. I'll have to search for those tables. The thing that interests me the most in your report, because we've been dealing with it in the Canada-China Committee, was the focus of an opposition motion last week in terms of foreign interference in Canada. I'm not particularly referring to China, although we did hear witnesses saying some of the things that are reflected here in terms of going from one place to another. So your report notes a lack of coordination, for example, and a lack of direction to go in. And I'm wondering, looking at the problems noted here, the challenges the RCMP faces by the operations focus primarily on counterterrorism, that intelligence provided by CSIS is difficult to use as evidence supporting criminal investigations, public safety only recently identified and dedicated resources to the issue of foreign interference. Till late 2017, interdepartmental collaboration on foreign interference was ad hoc and issue specific, and that prioritizing areas of concern that are most important is just been needed to be addressed, and that work in this regard is in its early stages. It seems to me, Mr. McGuinty, that all of this adds up to a kind of a conclusion in my mind that the whole issue of foreign interference has not really been taken seriously by these agents that were focused on agencies that are either focused on other things or don't have their act together, as it were, and we're very late in the game in doing this. Was that your conclusion as well?
I think the committee members would agree that there's, of course, a lot of progress to be made. I think they would agree
You're
that
being kind. You're being kind, I think.
Well, I think they would agree that the nature of foreign interference is evolving. I think they would agree that the seriousness of the threats are becoming better known, and we've tried to describe those threats throughout the report, throughout that chapter, that review. We focused on the core community members and actors. We laid out as well what the community is already doing, but we believe we have to use the language I used during the press conference, up our game on foreign interference. And that is why we pointed to the most obvious, successful, we think, reaction in a Five Eye partner country to deal with foreign interference, and that is the example of what's taking place in Australia. And there are many reasons set out for that in the report as well. So we hope the reader comes to the conclusion that they understand better what is going on, what other countries are doing, how they're dealing with it. I wouldn't say we're necessarily late to the game. I think the question of foreign interference is one that most countries are struggling with. And so we've laid out the facts and the evidence based on classified information as best we can. Of course, a lot of it's been redacted. And now we're calling on the government to bring a much more centralized, interdepartmental, intergovernmental approach, and at the same time, inform Canadians and inform parliamentarians.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
May I add something, Mr. Chair?
By all means.
Thank you. So just to add to what Mr. McGuinty said, I think it's important to point out that the time frame for our review was from January 2015 to August 2018. So the material we received reflects the findings and the status of the recommendations in our report. I think we do point out that, for example, CSIS has been talking and investigating about and investigating foreign interference since its creation. But we also point out that other departments, they don't necessarily neglect the threat, but their reaction and the whole of government reaction is very much ad hoc and on a case-by-case basis. So our recommendations are to strengthen the whole of government approach.
Thank you. You better not do this again, because Mr. Harris will start to think that his 6 minutes becomes 8 or 10. So with that, we have 25 minutes, colleagues, and I think we can actually squeeze in 6 more questions. So Mr. Van Popta, Madame Kara, 5 minutes each. Madame Michaud, Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes each. Madame Stubbs, 5 minutes, and I'll have to be advised by my Liberal colleagues who would be the final 5 minutes. So with that, Mr. Van Popta.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Mr. McGuinty, Ms. Marcoux. Mr. McGuinty, you had stated in answer to a question from my colleague, Mr. Kurek, plans to undertake or didn't undertake studies on foreign interference in elections, cyber threats and foreign acquisitions, but I think you said you were now going to undertake a study into cyber threats. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Is that your next study?
Sorry, it's one of our 2 next major reviews which are now underway. It's an examination of cyber threats and the ability of the government to respond to those threats, keeping in mind as well, sir, that under new legislation, new powers, a private sector actor can now approach the Minister of National Defense and ask for assistance if required, if a private sector actor is now the subject of major cyber threat activity.
Okay, good. Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for studies that this committee take to be very good work that your committee?
Well, you're breaking up there a little bit, sir,
yeah.
so I couldn't get all that. Sorry.
I think he was asking whether you have any recommendations for the Public Safety Committee to undertake that would be complementary to the work that you're undertaking.
It's always
you said it better
difficult.
than I did, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you. It's always difficult. There's so many interesting areas, and we don't generally speak openly from the committee perspective what we are or are not doing. We simply come to ground on what we're doing, then we announce it, and then we only speak once we produce something. You can imagine many of us were asked to comment last week about the Opposition Day motion, and all fine and good, but we don't generally respond, in fact, at all. But I think one interesting area that the committee might consider is the whole question of the Investment Canada Act and the whole question of tests that may or may not be applied now for the foreign acquisition of Canadian companies, and the sufficiency or insufficiency of that test or the metrics that are used. That could be helpful in a Canadian context in an increasingly globalized world. But we have decided internally, Mr. Van Popta, to reduce the number of reports and reviews. You can see why, perhaps, with the document in front of you. We'll be staggering the release of those as well.
Good, thank you. Mr. McGuinty, I think I'm not the only Canadian citizen who was surprised in reading this report at the extent to which Communist China seems to be infiltrating our media. And I'm referring particularly to paragraph 159 in your report, where there's a reference to a term, borrowing about to go out on the ocean, which I think is the implication there being that the People's Republic of China uses Western media to get their message out. I was shocked to hear to the extent to which that is happening. I guess my question is, going back to the Opposition Day motion about having a more robust relationship and reviewing that with our relationship with China, did the Prime Minister seek your advice as committee chair on the Opposition Day motion, which would seem to be very much in line with what your report?
No, he did not.
Suggest.
We've never spoken about that. Thanks for the question. We've never spoken about the Opposition Day motion, and I didn't participate in that debate. I'm hoping that the Opposition Day motion, though, will drive an awful lot of interest into the details laid out in this report, as you rightly point out. In this case, threats to media, what's going on, threats to our universities, threats to our ethnocultural communities, threats to the folks who are seeking public office. We thought it was really important to expose as much as we could, to be as transparent as possible, so Canadians understood the amplitude of the risk.
Good, thank you. We just want to congratulate. Sorry, am I out of time?
No, you've got half a minute.
Okay, just congratulate members of the Liberal Party who actually voted with us on that motion. Mr. McGuinty, I noticed you weren't one of them, which in retrospect maybe surprises me given the thoroughness of your report highlighting the threats coming from China.
I knew I shouldn't have given you that extra time. Yeah. Madame Kara, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to both our witnesses, Mr. McGuinty, for being here and for the incredible work that you and your committee does. I think it's extremely important. Perhaps, though, I can get you started on something very basic, because I find there are so many different versions or understanding of what foreign interference is amongst Canadians. But more importantly, there's a variety of different definitions of what foreign interference is across government agencies and department. If I can perhaps ask you to explain briefly what exactly foreign interference is, and if you can touch on in studying during your study, why do you think departments and agencies struggle to agree on the definition of foreign interference?
Well, that's an excellent question, and we try to tackle that, Ms. Kara, in the report in Chapter 2. In fact, in paragraph, I think it starts at paragraph 106, 107. And we talk about the definition, activities ranging from overt and often friendly forms of normal diplomatic conduct on the one hand to covert and hostile actions on the other. The CSIS Act goes some distance in describing what foreign interference is. And you rightly point out, one of the things we came up against fairly early on was the fact that there wasn't sort of a uniform nomenclature across the entire security and intelligence community, or an understanding. So, for example, if foreign interference were being exercised on the ground in a municipality somewhere, maybe a municipal election campaign, for example, or maybe in some other form or fashion, you wouldn't get necessarily an understanding from frontline police officers. If an outstanding female OPP officer came across something that might constitute foreign interference, she may not know what to do with it, or wouldn't understand it as foreign interference. So it's one of the things that we've addressed to lay out what it looks like. And again, in paragraph 108, we talk about the effects of foreign interference activities, what's at risk here, and it undermines a series of Canadian values.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing that up in terms of this in my line of questioning. I know, as you mentioned, one of the challenges of investigating suspected foreign interference is that these activities can take place alongside legitimate activities such as public diplomacy or academic collaboration, or may target specific ethnic diasporas to influence Canada's position domestically or internationally. Mr. McGinty, I represent one of the most diverse ridings in the country in Brampton West. Can you maybe talk a bit about what vulnerabilities does this pose to ethnic diaspora communities like mine? And I know sometimes many lines can be blurred to showcase if something is legitimate or illegitimate. Can you talk about the challenges that CSIS is having in investigating suspected foreign interference and how can it be addressed?
Maybe I can take a crack at it and maybe ask Ms. Marcoux to add something as well. Look, it's really important for committee members to hear our committee on this, and that is we're not singling out ethnocultural communities, as some have asked us in the past, because we want to negatively affect the perceptions of certain ethnocultural communities in Canada. On the contrary, we wanted to be really clear that it is different ethnic and cultural communities in Canada are the targets of foreign states. The committee emphasizes that these communities should be free from foreign threats and inducements. They're targets. And that's why, for example, we also highlight a measure that was passed through China, which basically extends extraterritorially a responsibility to Chinese Canadian nationals who are here, a so-called responsibility back to China. That is also laid out in detail in the report. Maybe Ms. Marcoux could answer a little bit of that as well, if you're okay.
Just a little less than a minute, please. Thank you.
Sure. So just getting back to your question about CSIS, then for an investigation to be initiated for foreign interference, it has to be very clearly presented or seen as detrimental to the interest of Canadians in Canada and of a clandestine or deceptive nature. So any activity that constitutes lawful advocacy, protest, or dissent, specifically excluded from investigation. But it's also why it's been so difficult for government and for certain agencies to present the threat from foreign interference, because it is so complex and can be misconstrued as legitimate discussions or protest.
Thank you.
I hope that
Thank you.
answers. Yeah.
Yeah, just the tech team has said to Madame Kara, could you move the boom on your mic up slightly? I don't know. Well, I'll leave it to you. You know, they said up, but you got it down. Anyways, Madame Michaud, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to discuss the CBSA portion in your report. You recommended for the Minister of Public Safety to develop directives for intelligence activities or defense intelligence activities and clear recommendations for accountability and annual reporting. What we see in this report, this should have been done or produced from the minister months ago or years ago. CBSA would have asked back in 2013 for instructions or clear instructions which weren't given yet. The agency, from what the press learned in the past weeks, approved certain directives, but there was no instruction from the minister. I would like to know, in your mind, why that wasn't officially published or why those directives weren't officially published yet. And the government seems to blame COVID-19 since this was supposed to be approved last February, but it seems to fit in with a larger picture. Could you say a few words on that? If I understood your question clearly, Mrs. Michaud, you're asking me about you want to know if the agency has authorities to send directives, or the minister? Does the minister have authority to send directives? The minister is supposed to send clear directives to CBSA on accountability and directives that are expected from the agency, that the agency has been expecting for a few years, and the previous Conservative government hadn't done so either. So based on your recommendation, could you elaborate on that? Could Mrs. Marcoux add something on that? Yes, absolutely. We haven't received a response from the minister yet. Within this review, we
saw that there weren't any ministerial directives, but we haven't heard a response as to why yet.
Harris, 2.5 minutes, please. You're on mute, Jack.
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Chair. Mr. McGuinty, thank you for your report. It's very sobering. I've got dozens of questions, but little time. But I will ask, I will note that the government has had this report for 15 months now. So the kind of responses that we're just talking about should already have been done. And I'm assuming that the government will have no trouble within 30 days to come up with a real robust plan in accordance with the motion of last week. But my question is more specific, dealing with one of your recommendations, which talks about assessing the adequacy of existing legislation that deals with foreign interference. I'm assuming that that's because you found various shortcomings in the legislation as it exists, and I wonder if you could take a few minutes to outline some of the inadequacies or some of the shortcomings or something that should be done to improve the ability of Canada to protect against foreign interference.
Would you be able, Mr. Harris, to point me in the right direction towards the right recommendation, the number?
So, well, I'm just looking at a briefing note here now, which talks about your comprehensive strategy for government, which talks about identifying short and long-term risks, etc. But it says assess the adequacy of existing legislation that deals with foreign interference, such as the Security of Information Act or the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act, and make proposals for changes if required. So yes. I think you did identify some inadequacies, and I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on what they are.
I can't right now off the top of my head. I'd have to find the operative passages in the report for you, which I'd be very pleased to do through the chair. Send you a written response in terms of those details, because I'm sure they're there. But I think this was formulated by the committee, that particular part of the recommendation, when I reflect back on the deliberations. It was about trying to make sure that a full examination, including the legislative and regulatory underpinnings of what was going on, were actually examined. Were all these pieces properly connecting? Were the powers exercised by one organization aligned with powers organized elsewhere? Was there a chance to, for example, up the understanding of what foreign interference is or is not? So I think the idea was that part and parcel of a government-wide response to foreign interference would include a necessary examination of the legislative underpinnings.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I'll have to leave it there. We've got 2 5-minute questions left. Madame Stubbs, 5 minutes, and then Madame Damhoff, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my understanding that I'll be taking this round. I think rural internet connectivity has to do largely with that. So, and I'm getting the thumbs up from
like Ms. Stubbs. No.
and could never replace her very, very valuable contributions. But thank you very much, and it's good to be able to continue asking these questions. In paragraph 290 and in the report, it says, quote, the government's public engagement on foreign interference has been limited. And a little bit later says, again, quote, there are no strategies or threat assessments to inform Canadians of foreign interference analogous to the yearly reports on terrorism. The report goes on to mention Operation Fox Hunt, which has been in the media as of late, in which the Communist Party of China threatens Chinese Canadians on Canadian soil. Has the committee reviewed whether or not the government has any measures to encourage Chinese Canadians to come forward to authorities and report any threats of intimidation they may be experiencing?
That's an excellent question, Mr. Kurek, and I don't recollect, and I'll have to get back to you on whether we examine that in detail, and I want to be very careful about what I do or don't say about that. Given sources and methods. I do share, and I'm glad you raised paragraph 290 around the very limited public engagement. Our understanding is that only the CSIS director has given a very powerful statement, first in a foundational speech, and then just several weeks ago, talking about the threat of foreign interference. But maybe if I could again, because she has a greater institutional memory, and perhaps Ms. Marcoux can offer something for you.
Sure.
You're right, Mr. Kirk, in the sense that there is no overall, or we did not come across or find an overall threat assessment produced by the government on foreign interference. And in fact, it is one of, I think, our major findings, major recommendations, is that be included as part of any government threat assessment. And it's also why the 2018 report from the first committee presented foreign interference as part of a review of threats to Canada. But Mr. McGuinty is right. The CSIS director has been among the most vocal in terms of talking about the threat of foreign interference, with a few speeches from ministers of public safety.
Okay, thank you very much for that. There is a fentanyl epidemic in this country, as we're all aware, and it's not limited specifically to fentanyl, but that sort of types of narcotics. And we're learning that a lot of this fentanyl is coming from China, flooding the country, and it destroys families and society, and certainly appears to be of strategic benefit to foreign state actors, specifically the Chinese Communist Party. Is there an aspect of foreign interference? Is this an aspect of foreign interference that your committee has heard about?
No, it's not something that we examined. We may have heard about it,
okay,
but it's not something we examined in detail.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. The report talks about the Chinese Communist Party using a strategy of pushing their political messaging through mainstream international media. Are you aware of whether or not that has been the case in Canada? If there's any examples where that might have been the case on Canadian networks such as CBC, CTV, other television or print media based in Canada?
Any and all comments I can make around media and foreign interference in that sector are in the report. We've highlighted and illustrated as best we can, Mr. Kurek, what we knew, what we came across. Of course, once again, this report is the redacted version of a much longer report, backstopped by, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, almost 30,000 pages of material.
Okay, and one final question. I hope I have enough time for a quick question, Mr. Chair.
30 seconds. Okay. 30 seconds.
Have you received a response from the Prime Minister or the Public Safety Minister on these reports that you've sent to them?
We've had a general acknowledgement, and we'll have likely more to say about this as we produce our 2020 annual report for the Prime Minister, something the committee is seized with. But we were pleased to see that at least in 2 mandate letters, there was a reference to an NSECOP recommendation and action called on from the Ministers of National Defence and Public Safety to revisit the overall legal framework for the conducting of intelligence activities at the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces.
Thank you, Mr. Kirk. We're going to have to leave it there. Madame Demoff, final 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. McGuinty, I first want to thank you for your leadership. I was part of the Public Safety Committee that reviewed the bill to create your committee, and you've been its first and only chair. And I just want to thank you for your leadership in doing something that the government hadn't done before. So your report talks about the benefits of diversity and how it's not being done particularly well. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on why diversity is a good thing to do, not from an inclusion point of view, but from a public safety point of view. And also if you think that systemic racism plays a role in the challenges that you've highlighted in your report.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Demoff, first of all, for your gracious remarks. It's been quite a journey for all of us on the committee, and we're really proud of the fact that we've managed to produce a series of nonpartisan reports adopted by members of all parties in both houses. So we hope that this might serve as a precedent, actually, in a difficult time when perhaps we need more nonpartisanship and we need more cooperation on the floor of the House to be able to move the country forward. And we certainly think that's an important approach to bring to national security. We did not look at the question of systemic racism per se inside our institutions or within the public service in particular. It's clear members I think would agree that it's ripe for recognizing the long-standing barriers that racialized minorities face in Canada and the need to dismantle those barriers everywhere. We did include, however, and we made sure to indicate in this diversity and inclusion review, we did include international comparative evidence that was studies that were undertaken by a couple of other organizations, and Ms. Marcoux can chime in here, the FBI, the CIA, and some other comparative information and analysis that indicates that those organizations in the security and intelligence community that are more diverse and more inclusive, are higher performing. And so not only is it, the committee feels, the membership of the Events Cup feels, not only is it foolish in and of itself to leave people behind and not be able to reach out and engage as many as we can in productive roles, it's also affecting the overall performance of the security and intelligence community.
You're on, Pam.
Sorry, Chair. Did Ms. Marco want to comment on that or not?
Yes, I think to add on to what Mr. McGuinty said is that the committee, and it looked at its counterpart in the ISC as well, but it felt very strongly based on the studies that the more language skills an organization has, the more community contacts, the more cultural competencies, for example, the better it is and the more flexible and open-minded it is to look at threats and to conduct its investigations. And as we've seen, it is less prone, for example, to what is called groupthink in an organization that is not diverse.
Thank you. Chair, I think I'm good at that. If
okay,
we want to
well,
end it there.
that's fine. We do have a minute and a half left, but I thank you for helping out with running the clock. One of the reasons that we have these meetings is that you can put flesh on what can be a dry and confusing report, and both Mr. McGuinty and Madame Marcoux have done exactly that, to the point where, as Mr. Harris says, we've got dozens of questions, and I noted the exchange with Mr. Iacono about how other countries make their colleagues aware of not only the content of these studies, but they raise the general awareness. So I think, Mr. McGuinty, you and I are going to have an offline conversation about how we can make sure that your reports and your works get a larger audience than possibly an hour before the Public Safety Committee. So again, thank you for your absolutely outstanding work. Please, on behalf of the committee, thank your colleagues on the committee for us, and as you can see, you've really stimulated the interest of members. So thank you, colleagues. With that, we'll suspend for 2 minutes while we re-empanel. Again, thank you, Madame Marcoux and Mr. McGuinty.
Thank you very much.
Robin Maynard as an author, and Mr. Boubiniere as a community activist. So I'll call on you for 7 minutes each, according to the order in which you are in the order papers. So with that, Madame Maynard, you have 7 minutes, please.
If I may just ask for your indulgence, Ms. Michaud is not in the room right now. Maybe we can wait. It's okay. We just wait a minute until she comes back.
Well, we do have a quorum, and we do, we don't have a hard stop at 6 o'clock, but we do have a tentative stop at 6 o'clock. Do we know where Christina is?
Yeah, I think she'll be back in a minute or two, Mr. Chair. It's kind of hard, I think, with the distance. I think you may not have seen her step out, but she's out.
Well, I don't. I think if she's out, she's out, and I think we should start. So with that, Madame Maynard, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you for having me. I have published extensively in peer-reviewed literature on racial and gendered harms of policing in Canada's past and present, most notably Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. I'm also a PhD student and Vanier Scholar at the University of Toronto. I'll be forwarding today an evidence-supported argument that sheds light on the increasingly popular and publicly supported calls across Canada to defund the police and highlight the potential, should this be taken up, to meaningfully address the systemic racism that is embedded into policing in Canada. The first point that I wanted to lay forward is that rather than upholding for many communities, policing is more accurately understood as a form of harm, particularly for Black communities and for Indigenous communities, as well as racialized communities, people living with mental health or substance use issues. For example, American Public Health Association 2018 policy statement affirms that law enforcement violence is a public health issue, addressing that police violence is itself a form of harm in our society. My work documents rampant racial profiling since the creation of police forces across Canada, documenting since the 19th century the heightened policing of Indigenous men and women, of Black men and women, and of other racialized communities. Studies conducted in Toronto, Edmonton, Montreal, Halifax, and Vancouver demonstrate that Black people are stopped by police at a rate anywhere from 2 to 6 times more frequently than white residents. Reports that came out by CBC and Radio Canada of dozens of Indigenous women being sexually or physically subjected to violence by the police, as well as police assaults of Majisa Phillips, Santana Rao, and other Black women, address that there is also a gendered element at stake in this systemic racism within policing in this institution. We know that this also has resulted in death, and that Black people are 20 times more likely to be shot by police in Toronto, according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Funding has continually increased for policing in Canada in a manner that is unparalleled to many other public services. For example, national spending on police operations has increased since the mid-90s, reaching $15.1 billion in 2017 to 2018. A 2013 government report noted that the cost of policing nationally has more than doubled since 1997, outpacing the increase, they note, in spending by all levels of government, including police salaries, which have increased by 40% since 2000, whereas most Canadian salaries have increased by 11%, according to Public Safety Canada. In the context of a COVID-19 economic downturn, reprioritizing has never been more crucial. We are also in a period where we have seen the increasing militarization of policing with particular harms for Black and Indigenous communities. For example, a report by Kevin Walby and Rosier in 2018 noted that the use of SWAT teams or tactical squads had increased by 2,000% over the last 4 decades, increasingly using police for routine activities, they write, such as executing warrants, traffic enforcement, community policing in response to mental health crises. For Black communities in particular, this militarization has at times been fatal or violent. For example, Somali refugee communities experienced raids in which they were assaulted with battering rams and flashbang devices, which an elderly Somali woman described as being physically brutalized, and in one instance told to die in the context of a tactical raid. In tandem with rising militarization and budgets, there has been an expanded scope in terms of an ever-expanding role for police officers in response to mental health calls, presence at schools, in schools more broadly. We've also seen a dramatic rise in police killings over the last 20 years. A CBC study called Deadly Force highlighted the number of deaths at the hands of police have nearly doubled over the past 20 years, particularly impacting Black and Indigenous communities. It's important to look to several limited reforms that have not reduced the funding, power, and scope or militarization of police and have also been ineffective in ending racial profiling and violence at policing. A 2018 Yale study, the most extensive to date, for example, found that body cams were not an effective way of addressing racism or violence in policing. A recent study conducted by Concordia University's Dr. Ted Rutland addressed how community policing, frequently proffered as a reform, has actually been both ineffective in ending systemic racism and has actually helped to expand and retrenched the harms of racialized policing even further in Montreal. Decades of feminist anecdotal evidence, as well as more documented evidence, has demonstrated the ineffectivity of police trainings. And of course, civilian oversights continue to be decried in the media and by access to information that show that there is not only a lack of independence being staffed largely by former police officers, but few investigations lead to charges and 0 or less than 1% of criminal convictions. This suggests that policing in Canada is not only flawed at a cosmetic level, but that the harms, racial and gendered, are structurally embedded into the institution itself. Police defunding.
Excuse me, Madame Maillard.
Yes.
You're speaking very quickly, and the interpreters are having a bit of a challenge keeping up with you. If you could just slow it down a touch, it'll be helpful.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
I'm proposing that the assortment of changes forwarded under the banner of defund the police are the most appropriate towards meaningfully addressing the issue of systemic racism in Canadian policing. Ending systemic racism requires that we undertake changes to minimize, reduce people's encounters with the police in a variety of ways. That is to say that only reducing policing can reduce the harm in policing. I will now briefly turn towards articulating what this means. Of course, much of what is being articulated at this time is related to public budget allocation, looking at the grossly disproportionate amount of public money that is spent and taxpayer money spent on policing each year compared to other vital issues such as shelters, long-term care, public education, and social housing. But more broadly, there is also within this call a move to decrease, minimize, and move away from a reliance on police in a way that is vastly more substantive, reducing the budget, in addition though, reducing the scope and reducing the power of policing are manners in which we are able to address the issue of systemic injustice more broadly. So reducing the scope, for example, is about minimizing areas where policing has been found to be most harmful. So for example, we can see the removal of police officers in schools in the Toronto District School Board, now seen as well in Hamilton, and there is important work being done advanced in this regard in Winnipeg and Vancouver. Reducing the scope has also been a push to ending police responses to mental health calls, given the tragic deaths of Regis Kaczynski-Paquet, DeAndre Campbell, and other Black and Indigenous and other people killed by police in the context of mental health crises. Ending police accompaniments to drug overdose calls has long been advocated by harm reduction practitioners as a way to reduce overdose death, and ending policing collaboration with Canada Border Services. These are all ways to reduce the scope of policing and the reach that it has in its harm over day-to-day people's lives. Another element of this is reducing.
Well, if you could just wind it up there, please. We're close. You're over some time.
All right. Well,